Ever since the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945, the United States has stood as the most powerful nation in the world. No other empire in human history has ever had such massive economic, military, and cultural influence over the world. America's power is so great that if she chose to, she could turn the world to dust in a storm of nuclear fire. But this march to superpower status was not an inevitability. There were several close calls during American history that could have put a permanent end to the nation's journey to the top of the world. The Newburgh Conspiracy, the War of 1812, the American Civil War. The Great Depression was another one of those close calls, and I'm going to explain why. On November 21st, 1938, Life magazine ran an article about how the Nazi regime in Germany portrayed the United States in their propaganda. One claim made was that America was in an ongoing civil war, describing the country as, quote, a chaos of little states, all with different laws. This picture used is from the Red River Bridge War, an armed confrontation between Texas and Oklahoma. Despite its name, and the Oklahoma National Guard bringing machine guns and a howitzer, to call it a war is an over-exaggeration. The only shots fired in the so-called war were fired by the Texans as target practice, and the only casualty was when an Oklahoman tripped on his own bayonet. To use such an incident to say that America was in a permanent state of civil war is an obvious lie. But the premise of internal instability in the so-called United States during this period isn't something to be dismissed in the realm of counterfactual history. It's certainly not something that was dismissed during the Depression. During his first term as United States President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt condemned lynching as murder on national radio, but chose not to support a federal anti-lynching bill. In a meeting with Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP in 1934, FDR explained that, quote, if I come out for the anti-lynching bill now, they, referring to certain Democrats, will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing. I just can't take that risk. A year later, Edward O'Neill III, president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, told the Senate that, quote, unless something is done for the American farmer, we will have a revolution in the countryside within less than 12 months. The American Midwest, in particular, seemed primed for a revolution in the early 1930s. North Dakota's Bismarck Tribune reported on January 8, 1934 that, quote, considerable talk is heard of secession from the Union by Midwest states if the Depression continues. 11 months earlier, Concurrent Resolution A2, a resolution calling for the secession of 39 states from the Union, was introduced to the North Dakota State Senate by Senator William Martin. This was a big deal. It was the first time since the American Civil War that secession was publicly proposed in the state legislature. Thankfully, the resolution died in committee, and Martin claimed after its death that he proposed it for, quote, educational purposes to wake up the people. Not even 6 months later, secessionism returned to North Dakota once again. In June 1934, Governor William Wild Bill Langer was convicted of conspiracy to defraud the federal government over campaign law violations. The North Dakota State Supreme Court declared Lieutenant Governor Ole Olson to be the new governor, but Langer refused to relinquish his power. Instead, he met with 10 of his friends, declared independence from the United States, declared martial law in Bismarck, and barricaded the governor's mansion. Thankfully, Langer brought North Dakota back to the Union after meeting with the state Supreme Court justices, relinquished his power as governor, and was cleared of all charges on appeal. Notably, in the Hearts of Iron 4 mod, Red Flood, Langer can become the leader of an independent, unified Dakota after the collapse of the United States. Remaining in the Midwest, this region of the country was a hotbed of socialism even before the Depression. In the 1924 election, the Socialist Party endorsed Wisconsin Senator Robert Fighting Bob LaFollette, I have no fucking clue if I pronounced that right, by the way, won 16.62% of the popular vote and even won electoral votes. Rare for a third party in the United States. While the Socialist Party saw a decline in 1928, its popularity was starting to bounce back by 1932. Self-described radical as hell, Minnesota Governor Floyd, I am not saying that middle name, Olson, told an emissary of FERA Administrator Harry Hopkins, quote, you go back to Washington and tell him that Olson is taking recruits for the Minnesota National Guard, and that he isn't taking anybody who doesn't carry a red card. Something tells me he wasn't talking about the Pokemon item. In addition, he stated that Minnesota is definitely a left-wing state. While socialism was arguably at its strongest in the Midwest during this time, The ideology wasn't unpopular in the rest of the nation in the wake of the Great Depression. Mississippi Governor Theodore G. Bilbo said in 1932 that, quote, "Right here in Mississippi, some people are about ready to leave a mob. In fact, I'm getting a little pink myself." If you've ever heard of the phrase pinko commie, you'll know Bilbo wasn't talking about his skin color. In California, socialist and author of The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, organized the End Poverty in California movement that won the majority in the 1934 Democratic gubernatorial primaries. Although Sinclair was defeated, he managed to secure over 37% of the popular vote, and former EPIC leaders had won the state governorship and a seat in the United States Senate later. Commonwealth federations in Washington and Oregon, modeled after the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, a left-wing Canadian political party, won a number of state and congressional posts and controlled the state Democratic parties for several years. In the summer of 1932, over 15,000 World War I veterans gathered in Washington, D.C., demanding their promised bonuses early. President Herbert Hoover, convinced by Secretary of War Patrick J. Hurley that the Bonus March, as it later came to be known, was plotting a communist revolution, authorized the use of tear gas and tanks to disperse the veterans. Hurley was obviously wrong, and his mistake annihilated Hoover's already low chances at getting re-elected, but it goes to show that the threat of a leftist revolution was taken very seriously at this time. Combining the two ideas of socialism and secessionism brings us to African American separatism in the Deep South. This idea goes back to the 19th century and was suggested by a racist white dude. On April 30th, 1861, Illinois Senator Orville Browning wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln. Browning wrote that, quote, "Our armies must march into the rebel states, and the Negroes will flock to our standard. What is to be done with them? We can't avoid considering and dealing with this question if we could. There is no escaping it. We must meet it and solve it, and we had better do it in advance before the emergency is upon us. Where they come, we cannot repulse them. We cannot butcher them. We cannot send them back to bondage. Heaven would blast us with its wrath if we did. We cannot incorporate them into our population in the free states. We cannot drive them into the sea. We cannot precipitate them upon any other country. Give up the cotton states to them. Let them have the soil upon which they were born, the climate which is congenital, the agriculture to which they have adapted and which they understand. Let such whites as may remain there at any time get away with all they can carry with them. They can't take away the soil. Give that up to the Negroes, and form them into a republic under the protectorate of this government." Browning's idea to emancipate the slaves and create a separate country for them was obviously a very radical proposal. The proposal also has its roots in bigoted ideas that two groups within the same species can't coexist as equals because of some arbitrary bullshit that unfortunately still persists to this day. But over half a century after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the concept of an African American state made a comeback. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson advocated self-determination for the people of Europe. Being the early 20th century, self-determination only applied to white people, but some black people didn't get the message. In January 1918, African-American communist Cyril Briggs wrote in his newspaper The Crusader that African Americans were, quote, "a nation within a nation, a nationality oppressed and Jim Crowed." This Crusader should not be confused with the Ku Klux Klan newspaper of the same name that supported Donald Trump in the 2016 election, by the way. Briggs considered the idea of a black enclave in the Pacific Northwest, but he later rejected the idea as being, quote, "unsatisfactory to both the Negro and the white man." In 1919, the Red Summer saw race riots occurring in over 36 cities across the United States. What started as peaceful protests against racial violence and injustice turned into white supremacist terror attacks with African Americans fighting back, resulting in hundreds dead. One participant in these protests was a World War I veteran by the name of Harry Haywood, who traveled to the Soviet Union and studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow. Haywood became friends with a Siberian man named Charles Nasanov, who had lived in the United States in the past and saw African Americans as members of an oppressed nation with a right to self-determination. In the North, where blacks were minorities, the official position of the 6th Comintern Congress in 1928 was equal rights. In the South, where there was a large black majority area called the Black Belt, the goal was the secession of this region and the formation of an independent republic. The establishment of this so-called Negro Soviet Republic became an official policy of the American Communist Party. Haywood wrote in 1934 that, quote, "We demand the withdrawal of the armed forces of imperialism from the Black Belt." However, the idea of a separate African American state in the South was not universally accepted among African Americans, with the Great Migration resulting in millions of blacks moving out of the South as a result of better economic conditions in the North. It's understandable that a lot of them wouldn't exactly want to go back. The NAACP denounced black separatism as, quote, "a plan of plain segregation." In a sense, Browning's spirit lived on in the Negro Soviet Republic idea. Throughout this video, I have discussed people and movements who sought to tear America apart. Yet you might notice that secession and revolution only account for 2 of the 4 capitalized words entitled this video. What about the word dictatorship? To quote Matt Mitrovich in his review of Brandon Du Bois' American Eagle, wouldn't Americans be unable to, quote, ignore more than a century-long history of democratic government? While I understand that this review was written in a pre-capital insurrection world, the Patriot Act alone debunks the idea that Americans would never sign away their personal liberties. But it's not necessary to look at the post-9/11 Bush administration for proof of this. Here's FDR's first inaugural address, delivered on March 4th, 1933. Take note of the audience's reaction to what Roosevelt says.
In the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
The people of the United States wanted, as Walter Lippmann wrote in the weekly business magazine Barron's, quote, a mild species of dictatorship. The 6-time Socialist Party presidential candidate Norman Thomas wrote over 30 years later that, quote, never before or since have I heard such open and bitter cynicism about democracy and the American system. In the face of the Chad autocracies of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Soviet Union, the virgin democracies of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France seemed inadequate to combat the depression. Pennsylvania Senator David Reed said in 1932 that, quote, if this country ever needed a Mussolini, it needs one now. This statement in particular might confuse a modern-day viewer. Today, Benito Mussolini is associated with creating a fascist dictatorship in Italy and leading his nation into war alongside Hitler. But, similar to Vladimir Putin before he invaded Ukraine, Mussolini was praised in Western countries before he invaded Ethiopia. The New York Herald Tribune's headline on Inauguration Day read, quote, for dictatorship if necessary. On February 1st, 1933, Walter Lippmann told President-elect FDR that, quote, the situation is critical, Franklin. You may have no alternative but to assume dictatorial powers. FDR's wife, Eleanor, who was always a lot more liberal than her husband was, privately suggested to her husband that he should become a, quote, benevolent dictator. Of course, dictatorship was only supported if it was the right kind of dictator. And when I say the right kind of dictator, I mean the far right kind of dictator. Roosevelt got a lot of undeserved flack, and still does today to an extent, for allegedly being either a communist or a socialist. Pennsylvania Representative Robert Rich stated in 1935 that, quote, Roosevelt is a socialist, not a Democrat. And Ohio Senator Simon D. Fest reportedly said in 1934 that, quote, the New Deal is now undisguised state socialism. These comments all make sense because the government doing something to help people is the first step towards a Stalinist dictatorship. Maybe Richard Wolff was right. In response to all these claims, Norman Thomas, an actual socialist, wrote a pamphlet in which he described FDR as a state capitalist, and that's probably a more accurate label. FDR himself addressed these red-baiting claims in a speech in 1936, stating that, quote, I repudiate the support of any advocate of communism or of any other alien ism which would by fair means or foul change our American democracy. Whatever the president's economic or ideological stance was, reality doesn't matter to fascists or their sympathizers on Wall Street. The individuals involved in what became known as the business plot met with retired Marine Corps General Smedley Butler and offered him $18,000 to lead an army. The general was no fan of Il Duce, but his criticisms of American capitalism and imperialism made him an ideal individual for the men who wanted the Roosevelt administration done away with. The plotters anticipated that in around a year, Butler would be able to mobilize 500,000 World War I veterans for the putsch. With control of the newspapers, the plotters would run stories saying that FDR's health was failing, Butler would march on Washington and demand that the president step aside. The plotters reasoned that Vice President John Nance Garner wouldn't want to become president and that Secretary of State Cordell Hull would also refuse due to his age. From there, Butler would take the position of Secretary of General Affairs, reinstitute the gold standard, and save capitalism. Roosevelt would either become a puppet of the new fascist regime, as the king in Italy was, or forced to resign. Thankfully, Butler saw the plot for what it was: treason. He spilled the beans to the House of Representatives, who went on to confirm the general story. The nation's major newspapers, again all controlled by the plotters, ridiculed the story and called it a hoax. Modern historians disagree on how close the Wall Street Putsch was to execution, but agree that there was a plot to initiate a regime change. To quote American historian Nicholas Fox Weber, the fascist government General Butler exposed did not get very far, but that plot had in it the three elements which make successful wars and revolutions: men, guns, and money. While the failure of most attempts to either tear away the United States or place the whole country under a dictatorship can be explained away, what happened to a revolution in the countryside within less than 12 months? What happened to secession from the Union by Midwest states if the Depression continues? Why was Walter Lippmann wrong when he said there was no alternative but to assume dictatorial powers? I think our old friend Norman Thomas once again can give us an answer. He was once asked about why the Socialist Party failed to become a viable third party in the wake of the Great Depression. But his answer to this question can be applied to the question of why 1930s America never experienced any large-scale secession, revolution, or dictatorship. If you want to know his answer, subscribe and look out for the sequel to this video. It won't be the immediate next video after this one, because that one will be a sequel to The Greatest Opportunity, but I recommend you do so regardless even if you haven't seen that video or aren't interested in the premise. I'm the Counterfactor, and thanks for watching.
Big bang bankroll, got cheat codes. Certified in the hood, boy, they all know. Don't be asking y'all that you gotta know to know. Got a pocket full of cash, so the whole boat. See, I've been thugging since a young and I ain't got a bang. My name been ringing bells since I was like 14. Been service stacking from all of the dope fiends. And I ain't tripping, y'all can get it, you ain't get from me.